Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to be here. I missed last year, so it was the second one after Lisbon for me. And ASPO used to be a kind of perceived as a kind of organization that was very much outside of the mainstream. And still, I think, which is interesting, we don't find many people here representing major oil companies, international institutions, governments. I think the Irish government is very courageous to be here at a very high level. And it's the first time that we got my former boss, Jim Schlesinger, here as the keynote speaker, Lord Oxburn, former chairman of Shell. So I think people are beginning to pay attention. But we have an uphill battle, because the majority of people in my side of the business, the energy economist, still doesn't believe in the concept of peak oil. Every year, the Department of Energy in Washington, they do an analysis of the long-term outlook, and then they send a list to about 20 different, what they consider to be senior economists in the United States, and then ask them, what is do you think your price outlook for the period of the forecast of until 2030? Well, the latest one, and that will only be published next March, is $60 in real dollars of 2006 until 2030. So quite clearly, the energy economists don't believe in peak oil. CIRA published a study in 2030. They show a peak in 2030, followed by a several decades-long plateau until at least 2070. So if you believe that, there's nothing to worry about. OPEC just released its forecast until 2030. Out of 150 pages, 6 are devoted to supply, 0 pages to OPEC supply. In the supply side, it sees non-OPEC production continuing to rise through the period of the forecast. So what OPEC is concerned about is there's not enough demand. On the EIA side, the part of the United States Department of Energy, basically in the business as usual case, the main case, the reference case, it's demand driven, and they fill it up nicely with supply from OPEC and non-OPEC. Again, there is no constraint through the period of the forecast 2030. The IEA in last year's outlook basically had a similar kind of picture, but then began to change, as was already said this morning, more recently talking about an unsustainable outlook, but that unsustainable is not necessarily based on peak oil. It's partly based on the global climate change, because the IEA most recently has said that we might reach the 550 parts per ppm of CO2 emissions before 2015. And that there's basically very little at this point that can be done about it. If that is the case, of course, it could be potentially very serious. And so one avenue that we really haven't looked at, particularly as ASPO, is to see to what extent basically the warning signals coming out of here are basically asking for the same kind of solutions that the people who are concerned about global warming are looking at. So maybe there should be some kind of a dialogue between those two groups. If we take the broader definition now of peak oil, which is broader than the one just looking at the purely technical one, I think you get the kind of picture that we heard from this morning's panel. And that includes, of course, in addition to the purely technical side of decline rates and reserve additions, the lack of technical experts. We find it all over the industry. Many of them are retiring, and we don't have enough mid-level petroleum engineers, geologists, and so on to multiply the kind of efforts that are required to get into smaller fields in a non-conventional oil. Equipment problem. The industry is not prepared to build enough offshore rigs, platforms in time to increase capacity where it's needed. Because the study by Dr. Sandrea, the father and son, that came out last year in the Oil and Gas Journal, indicates that onshore production has already peaked globally, but offshore is where the growth is, and there we don't have enough platforms and we don't have enough rigs to sustain the kind of growth that is required. Capital investments, we already heard this morning, particularly if you put the capital investments, the massive increases in the cost versus the hurdle rate of the industry, which we heard again this morning, around $35 a barrel. Access to oil, we heard it this morning too, also part of it. The IOCs, which used to control most of the world's oil prior to the 1970s, now control 5% of the world's oil, and 70-some% is controlled by OPEC and another 12% by countries like Russia and Kazakhstan and others. the slow development of the non-conventional oils, we also heard this morning, domestic consumption in the producer states, and then of course the geopolitics, which is rapidly changing from Venezuela to Nigeria to the Middle East to Russia to Kazakhstan, all creating impediments to growth on the production side. And then what we didn't talk about is yet, but if, as it appears likely, the major producers of natural gas, Russia, Iran and Qatar, and to a lesser extent Nigeria and a few others, if they reach a kind of, not for reasons of resources, but for reasons of domestic policies and other geopolitical reasons, if they reach a kind of a plateau sometime by the middle of the next decade, then we will not see as much incremental growth in the NGLs coming out of those countries. So I think if we take this broader view of peak oil, you'll find that there are more and more people who are adherents to this view. But when we look at the demand side, we're really still talking about uncharted waters, because neither one of these major institutions has made a study basically putting an artificial ceiling on supply and feed that back into their models to see what it would do to demand and what kind of a disequilibrium you would get in the global economy. Because all these models are based on a price of oil, and which through equations you get energy demand, and then through other equations you get it filled up with so much coal, so much nuclear, so much oil, so much gas, and then they fill it up on the oil side using, again, your geological surveys, optimistic mid-case, and it gives you numbers that are way beyond what anybody here was talking about for non-OPEC, and huge numbers for OPEC that my friends in the Middle East, at least, and North Africa tell me are not sustainable. So, but the effort hasn't even been tried to look at the supply side and say, well, let us put this constraint even for internal reasons and see what it will do. It just doesn't exist. So we're really working here in uncharted waters. I will go through these. I'm afraid to have to go through some of these extremely fast because of lack of time, but you can look at them at leisure when you're at home. Basically, it shows, how when you move from primitive society to technological man today, what a vast increase you get in energy consumption. And mind you, when you see the biggest growth that's taking place now in the developing world is the massive move from people from the agricultural sector, from agricultural subsistence to urban areas. Once you move to urban areas, you need enormous growth in electricity, followed by significant growth in the transportation demand. Now, see in this world, this is a picture from the United States Energy Department from 1650 till now. You see, it's kind of only very recently that we have moved on a large scale into commercial energy, and oil, even more recently, that you see that when I was born, we're actually at the very beginning of when oil was really becoming a significant factor in the global energy markets. And now already when by the time I retire, I may have seen peak oil in such a short time. It is unbelievable how fast this has gone. Just very quickly about the past developments. Well, until the 1950s, oil was an American fuel. I think the rest doesn't show up here. Well, maybe it's like this. Oil was basically an American fuel because 1/3 of the world's oil reserves were in America, United States. Half of the consumption was in America, half of the production was in America, and nobody perceived in America that there ever would be a shortage. The people from Ireland during the potato famine who went to America went there because it was the land of plenty. Nobody in America ever thought there was a limit to the production of food, to the production of raw materials, to the production of anything. Then in the period that I grew up in Holland as a child, Europe and Japan recovered on an ocean of cheap oil, $1 a barrel oil. That's what we had after the war. So what we do, we shifted very quickly from coal. We were coal economies, America too, prior to the Second World War. We shifted very quickly from coal to oil because oil was dirt cheap when all these big fields were developed by the Seven Sisters who were competing for market share. Then we got in the 73 to 81 period a tenfold price increase, followed by major changes in oil markets and the oil industry. Well, people say, well, why doesn't this happen again? We haven't seen now a 3 times increase of the price in this decade. Well, this was unique because we had shifted everything from coal into oil. In this period, we were shifting the heavy end of the barrel out of oil into nuclear, into coal, into gas, and we also shifted residential commercial away from oil into gas. And so this was a once and for all major shift that took place in that period following a 10 times increase in the price of oil. So then we get a period where we all fell asleep, from 86 until really the 1990s, and the Goldilocks years. Prices were not too high for the consumer to worry about it, and not too low for the producers not to produce. So those were actually the nicest year. They'll never come back. Then we got the fourth oil shock, which demand-driven, not supply-driven, in 2004. Still a demand explosion in 2004, 3 million barrels a day, almost demand growth in 2004, which was the first time since the 1970s. Non-OPEC production beginning to stagnate in 2005, exacerbated by the hurricanes in the United States. And then we are now going towards the period of where we're in now until the end of this decade, in which there's still a lot of questions, which we'll briefly say something about. And then we get the longer-term issues post-2010, and there the key issue is providing adequate fuels at reasonable prices for the world's emerging economies. Because we have to remember that while we are talking about peak oil, only 20% of the world's population has benefited really from the oil age. The other 80%, they want what we have. Now, are they going to get it? That's a big question. These are too many numbers in there, so don't pay too much attention. Look at the bottom line, which shows from 1950, when the world was running at about 11 million barrels a day of oil, to where we are now, about 84 million barrels a day. And only this period from the 1980, 1985 that we see an actual decline as a result of the shift away of the bottom of the barrel to other forms of energy. But what was still driving the market, even in those years, was the demand in the Asian tiger economies, where demand still kept rising despite the high prices. And that's one to keep in mind for the future. So when we moving into the future of the economy, is I think what we are witnessing now, unfortunately at the same time we were talking about peak oil, is probably the biggest economic revolution in 150 years. 150 years ago, India and China were 55% of global GDP. It dramatically declined, in part of colonization, in part because the Chinese empire fell apart, and there was also the invasion by foreign powers. But anyways, until the 1950s, their share of global GDP started declining. Now, for the first time in the new global economy, we see a massive reversal of 150 years of economic history, and we see that China is turning into the workshop of the world. Then we're complaining that they're using a lot of energy and pollution. Yes, but part of the reductions in our, particularly in the industrial sector, of our energy economies in the industrial country is our outsourcing. Quite a significant part is due to outsourcing, so the pollution happens in China and the growth in oil demand happens in China. On top of that is while you have a huge number of people who are now moving into the urban society, there are somewhere around 500 million people in China and India together who are in purchasing power parity, not in US dollars or euros, middle class, and are beginning to enjoy the benefits of the modern energy and oil economy, and they want, like I wanted when I was in the 1950s, a little child in Holland, they want a nice car. It's the same thing that people want all over the world. The only problem is with Asia is that, with the exception of West Asia, which we call the Middle East, Asia is rather energy poor, and particularly poor in oil and gas resources. So now there are emerging industrial giants. They are now faced with certainly the end of cheap oil, and perhaps, as we heard this morning, the emergence of a very, very expensive oil, and the issue of global warming, where we are telling them, well, really, the only thing you have in China in great abundance is coal, but we really don't want you to use it. And if you want to use it, you should have CO2 sequestration, which we don't even know in our world how to cope with this issue. So just very quickly on the difference in perceptions. Now, we were talking about a real crunch coming on. This is the OPEC view of the OPEC Secretariat. OPEC looks at relatively modest growth in the medium term, but at huge growth in non-OPEC and OPEC supply. So OPEC internal view is, over the next 5 years, we're going to have a significant surplus of oil. So we better keep the screws on the supply, because we're going to have too much supply. This is what OPEC believes. The IEA, on the other hand, is, and I don't have a nice graph of this, but it's the latest medium-term forecast that came out in July, is basically looking at much higher demand. I think it's too high by my own perception, because it's underlying very high economic growth, which we may not have for that 5-year period. Then they're looking at modest continued growth in non-OPEC supply and in growth in OPEC. But the key issue where OPEC is beginning, or IEA is beginning to change, they see a growth in spare capacity until 2010 and then beginning again a decline with a very small spare capacity in 2012. So subsequently, the chief economist of the IEA said in an interview in Le Monde in June that if Iraqi production doesn't rise exponentially by 2015, we'll have a very big problem. And even if Saudi Arabia fulfill all of its promises, the numbers are very simple. There's no need to be an expert. So I will go beyond this now more quickly. The IEA views, you'll find it in the handout that you will get, but I want to go through these things fairly quickly. This is the continued growth as in the basic scenarios of the IEA. You will find similar ones by OPEC and others. We find that their perception is that fossil fuels, even 30 years out, will still be the bulk of global energy demand. And biomass will still continue to be in renewables very small. And most of the demand will be in the developing countries. What is important, and maybe there is some area where we have to look at, is that most of the demand for oil is in the transportation sector. In the US, about 70% of the barrel is used for transportation. Western Europe, a little bit less, about 60%. The world average is about 50%, and China is considerably lower because more oil is still used there in the industrial sector. So what that means, and this is worthwhile looking at, when prices go up, when we approach peak oil, when prices go up, there's still a lot of room, assuming that we build the refining capacity, to take the 10 million barrels a day that is still used in the utilities, electric utilities, that we upgrade those and turn it into transportation fuels with additions to our refineries. And there are some other sectors where we can still further back out oil, and it will happen by the price mechanism itself if we get the kind of prices that were discussed this morning. But where I find the big problem is on the per capita consumption. Here, for example, the per capita oil consumption per person per year in barrels per year. With the United States at the top, Europe is lower than Europe of the 15 because Eastern Europe drags down the rest of Europe. But Europe and Japan are probably around the same, 15, 16 million barrels per year of consumption per person. South Korea on the OECD is also the similar kind of range. But then you see the middle income countries, they're in the kind of 8 to 12 barrels per person per year. But then you look what China is, just over 2, and India is less than 1 barrel per person per year. So oil-producing countries are higher because of the oil economy. They use a lot of it to produce petrochemicals and other forms of energy. So even if in the IEA projections they see that China reaching the Thai level by 2025, it's still extremely conservative because Thailand is by no means a developed country. And if we are looking at, like the World Bank and IMF do, at sustained levels of growth of 8% in China through 2025, it's probably going to be higher than that. Here you see by 2025, basically the outcome of these assessments. China is still very, very low. I think it's much too low compared to the direction China is going into at the moment. Now, this is important because if you assume that 100 million barrels a day, give or take, is about the limit of what the world is likely to produce, then the world can never live like the Italians live today, because then we would need about 260 million barrels a day, and let alone the Americans, we would need 454 million barrels per day of production. So we get stuck at about 100 million barrels a day. The kind of level of consumption will have to dramatically decline in the industrialized countries while rising in the developing economies. This is some ones on the, I will go to that very quickly. This is important. No, a number of publications come out recently. They see a doubling of the car fleet by 2025. From 1 billion cars in the world now to about 2 billion cars in 2025. Here you see one on China alone, different estimates from Goldman Sachs to the IMF, massive growth in private car use in China, and China is planning to build a road system bigger than that of the United States, or certainly equal to that of the United States, to run all these cars on. So that is going to require massive volumes of demand. Work done by Professor Dermot Gately at NYU suggests that both the IEA and the EIA and OPEC elasticities for oil demand for the developing countries are much too low, and he is looking at an oil to GDP ratio of about 0.5, just over 0.5, whereas the IEA and the EIA at about 0.35. And the net result is that Professor Gately and the other one that I quoted here, Professor Rossi, see actually some 20 million barrels a day more growth in the developing countries by 2025, 2030 than in the public forecast that we have seen. So I think we're getting close to the end. Oh, one thing here is that in case of India, India is about 15 years behind in terms of economic growth behind China, so India has a much longer way to go. That's why we see still the growth in Indian consumption substantially less than in China. Here we talked briefly about non-conventional fuel. This is from the Department of Energy in the US. More or less what we heard this morning, in an optimistic scenario, about 10 million barrels a day of non-conventional fuels, but you see the bulk of it is from heavy CO2 emitters, oil sands and ultra-heavy crudes, whereas biofuel, very small. I think coal to liquids is exaggerated, particularly since the cancellation of the Exxon project in Qatar. We have now only one project going, in addition to the small project that already exists in Qatar, and that's the Shell project for about 140,000 barrels a day. And then there's a smaller project also in Nigeria. But they're never going to reach the kind of levels that you see, which would be in excess of 1 million barrels a day. And similar with coal to liquids, the future is not all that optimistic. As for biofuels, I don't think there's really much time to go into it. But the current version of biofuels from grains, from corn, at best we have an energy input-output ratio that is about equal. In other words, we get as much output as inputs. And we have seen already with about 20% of the corn crop in America going to fuel, it has had a significant impact on the cost of food. If we were to go to a much higher level, that of course will further strengthen. The same in Europe. The problem in Asia is different. If you go to significant palm oil production in a country like Indonesia, you have to burn more forest, and underneath the forest is peat. The combination of the peat and the forest will give you more CO2 emissions than the benefit you will gain from the palm oil. So we have a lot of issues to resolve, and cellulosic ethanol, which might be the future, but we are still there. We need some technological breakthroughs to turn that from a laboratory fuel into a commercial fuel, and that may take much, much longer than most people today, particularly optimistic politicians, believe it will be. So we're still talking about fairly small fuels. This is the last one I just want to show from the Institut Français du Pétrole. They did a big study together with Total. And what is the importance of that study, in my opinion? That was done by a major oil company, third biggest oil company in the world, together with the experts from the French Petroleum Institute, and basically came to the conclusion last year that if there were absolutely no constraints and the international oil industry could go in all over the world, produce all the oil in the world as quickly as they produce the North Sea, perhaps a technical limit on oil production could be postponed until 2020-28 in this study. But because of the constraint that I mentioned when I started out, they have actually concluded that perhaps 100 million barrels a day is what we may see as the limit. Now, they see that around, as Monsieur Bouqui said this morning, at around 2015, 2020, but since we are already at 86 million barrels a day, if the demand keeps rising at 1.5 million barrels a day, as it has in recent years, we would be there in 10 years. So I leave you with this because this is one of the studies I respect most. Why? Because the head of the company, first head of a company, Total, Desmarais, and his successor, de Margerie, both went on record saying the world may never produce more than 100 million barrels a day. Now, I wish that next year at this meeting here, that we'll have some company representatives from some of the other oil companies who are beginning to say, well, there is some validity in this, because then we'll make a move in the right direction, and hopefully then we will be on the way to finding solutions for where we are now really completely in the dark. We have a situation where the demand is likely to significantly outstrip supply, while 80% of the world, 75% of the world has never benefited really from the benefits of the oil economy that we have. So for us now it's easy to say, well, we have to do with less. But imagine if the Americans in 1950 had come to us in Europe and said, well, you just have to do with less. We in America will stay as we are, we have nice cars, we live well, but you in Europe, you should do with what you have. Now that is the picture we are painting here on the demand side. We're telling the people in Asia and Latin America and Africa, you'll have to do with what you have, because this is the picture. I don't have a solution, I just want to raise the question. I think this is something that has to be picked up and discussed much more seriously to see where we will go, because as Monsieur Bouki indicated, a lot of long-term solutions, but time is of the essence. It takes 20 years to turn over the American car fleet. It takes time to build the refining capacity to turn the heavy fuel oil that we still use into light fuels. 5, 6 years are enormous constraints on the construction companies today. You might have even much longer lead times. So we have a real problem on our hands, and we better start thinking about it in our international institutions and bring it to the attention of the mainstream political leadership. Thank you very much.